Hey everyone, welcome to Budget Commander. On this week's episode, we have Nikya of the Old Ways from the new set Ravnica Allegiance. If you haven't watched before, we take a new commander each week and build it with a $100 budget. And at the end of the video, we'll go over a couple upgrades that you can make to the deck with no budget considerations in mind. Stay tuned to the end of the episode where we'll go over a sneak preview to next week's deck and a way to win next week's deck in a giveaway that will go to one of our lucky listeners. Nikya of the Old Ways is 3, a red, and a green for a 5/5 legendary creature centaur druid. It says, you can't cast non-creature spells. Whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana of any type that land produced. This card is really powerful because you're able to double your mana with Nikya on the battlefield and cheat mana costs. The only downside is that you can't cast non-creature spells. The way we built this deck is that we have a lot of creatures in the deck, over 50 of them, and very minimal on the non-creature spells, but we did include a few non-creature spells that are really powerful because it's not always guaranteed that your Nikya is going to stick around because of her ability on there is really strong. So your opponents are going to try to remove her. Our deck strategy is that we're going to play creatures to ramp early, draw cards off of our card draw creatures, play some control elements, and then we're going to drop our Nikya and double all of our mana, and then we're going to eventually win through combat. Let's start out with talking about some ways that we're able to ramp in this deck early on. So first up, we have Somberwald Sage. Tap it, add 3 mana of any one color to your mana pool. Spend this mana only to cast creature spells. So this is really strong in this deck because we have over 50 creatures. So we're able to tap this and add 3 mana, which is really powerful. Then we have Magus of the Candelabra. X and tap, untap X target lands. So this is really strong with Nikya on the battlefield, as you can tap all of your mana and then use the Magus to untap it all and then tap it again. So you're able to get a lot of mana with this creature on the battlefield. And then you have Zendikar Resurgent. Whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana to your mana pool of any type that land produced. Then it also says whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. So this is going to give you an ability similar to Nikya's and also give you the ability whenever you cast a creature spell, you draw a card, which is really good in this deck because we have a lot of creatures that we're going to be playing. Then we have Ulvenwald Hydra. Ulvenwald Hydra's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. When Ulvenwald Hydra enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a land card and put it onto the battlefield tap, then shuffle your library. One note here is it does say land cards, so this is any land that's in your deck, so it can grab anything. So this is really good in this deck. Then we have Yavimaya Druid. When Yavimaya Druid enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a forest card and put it onto the battlefield tapped under target player's control. If you do, shuffle your library. Then we have Burnished Heart. 3 generic, sacrifice Burnished Heart. Search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, and shuffle your library. So this is a way that you're able to get some lands onto the battlefield through creatures in order to take advantage of Nikya's ability. Since we're not able to play non-creature spells when Nikya is on the battlefield, we have to use a lot of utility creatures that have special abilities on them. So first we'll talk about creatures that allow us to draw cards. So we have Soul of the Harvest. Whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. Then we have Beast Whisper and Primordial Sage, and they both have the same ability that says whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. So since we have over 50 creatures in this deck, we will be drawing a lot of cards off of these creatures. Then we have Sandstone Oracle that says when Sandstone Oracle enters the battlefield, choose an opponent. If that player has more cards in hand than you, draw cards equal to the difference. And then we have Dustwatch Recruiter that says pay 2 and a green, look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So this isn't really technically card draw, but it is a way to filter some of your mana that you're going to have off Nikya into a creature that's going to get you more creatures to play. Then we have Regal Force. It says when Regal Force enters the battlefield, draw a card for each green creature you control. Again, we're going to have a lot of green creatures in this deck. We have over 50 creatures, and when this comes down, it's going to draw you a ton of cards. Then we have Runic Armasaur. Whenever an opponent activates an ability of a creature or land that isn't a mana ability, you may draw a card. In Commander, your opponents are going to be activating a lot of abilities, so this is a good way to draw some cards. Then we have Lifecrafter's Bestiary. At the beginning of your upkeep, scry 1, and whenever you cast a creature spell, you may pay green. If you do, draw a card. So at the beginning of every turn, you're going to be able to scry and get some of your dead draws off the top of your library, and then whenever you cast a creature, which our deck is filled with, you can pay a green, you'll draw a card. Then we have Guardian Project, which is a new card out of Ravnica Allegiance that says whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, draw a card. So this is really good in Commander because every single card in your 99 is a different creature. So anytime you play a creature, you're going to be able to draw a card off of this. We have several creatures in the deck that are able to help us play a control strategy against decks that play a lot of non-creature spells. So first up, we have Nullstone Gargoyle. Whenever the first non-creature spell each turn is played, counter that spell. So this does almost nothing against your deck, since we only have a few non-creature spells in the deck, and does a lot against your opponents, as they'll be playing a lot of non-creature spells. Then we have Rurik Thar the Unbowed. Whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, Rurik Thar deals 6 damage to that player. So this puts your opponent in a hard spot if this is on the battlefield and they want to cast, for example, a Brainstorm. They're going to have to make a decision if it's worth paying that 6 life for that Brainstorm or that Ponder that they want to cast. This is really strong against storm-based decks and spell-heavy themes. Then we have Yeva, Nature's Herald. This has Flash and says you may cast green creature spells as though they had Flash. This makes it to where you're able to play your creatures at instant speed. If you're going up against a control-type deck, you're able to cast it on their end step and put them in a spot where they have to tap their mana out to counter. There are a couple creatures in this deck that give you some protection against blue decks and counter spells. So there's Prowling Serpapard. Prowling Serpapard can't be countered. Creature spells you control can't be countered. And then we have Spellbreaker Behemoth. Spellbreaker Behemoth can't be countered. Creature spells you control with power 5 or greater can't be countered. This is a great way to get around some of the counter spells and make sure your creatures get on. Since we're not able to play non-creature spells, we do need a way in this deck to remove opposing creatures. So we have a couple of creatures in here that enable us to have our creatures fight opponents' creatures. So there's Uvenwald Tracker, 1 in a green, tap it. Target creature you control fights another target creature. Then we have Gruul Rage Beast. Whenever it or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, that creature fights target creature and opponent controls. This is a great way to drop a big creature onto the battlefield and then clear the way for your attacks. Next set of creatures provide a lot of utility in a deck that typically doesn't have that much, since we're playing mostly creatures. So we have Archetype of Endurance. Creatures you control have hexproof. Creatures your opponents control lose hexproof and can't have or gain hexproof. This is really great against commanders that have hexproof attached to them. So we'll use, for example, Narset. It's going to make it to where you're able to interact with that Narset with some of your creatures, like, let's just say your fight creatures, and you're able to get rid of that Narset before it's able to go off. Then we have Steel Hellkite. It's a flying dragon that says X. Destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost X, whose controller was dealt combat damage by Steel Hellkite this turn. Activate this ability only once each turn. So this is a great way that you're able to get rid of some problematic permanents if you're able to connect with your Steel Hellkite that you might not otherwise be able to get rid of in a red and green deck. Then we have Goreclaw, Terror of Calcisma. Creature spells you control with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast. Whenever Goreclaw, Terror of Calcisma attacks, each creature you control with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn. So this provides 2 benefits. First off, it's going to make your creatures cost less to cast. So you're able to get down some of your big threats early. And then also, whenever it attacks, you're going to be able to give all your creatures +1/+1 in trample if their power is over 4 or more, which most of the creatures in this deck are. These next 2 creatures provide a lot of value in our deck. So first up, we have Courser of Crufix. Play with the top card of your library revealed. You may play the top card of your library if it's a land card. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. So this is a great way to get some of those dead lands off the top of your library, and if you don't have a land in your hand, this basically is going to draw you a card if there's one on top of your library. Then we have Vizier of the Menagerie. You may look at the top card of your library, and you can do this at any time. You may cast the top card of your library if it's a creature card. You may spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast creature spells. So this is going to help us in 2 different ways. So you can cast the top card of your library if it's a creature card. So it's a great way to draw cards if you have creatures sitting on the top of your library. And then it's also going to help you in the way that a Chromatic Lantern is going to help you with your lands. You don't have to really worry about the way you tap your mana. There are a few ways in this deck to give your creatures haste, which is important because we want to be able to get in for combat damage right away when the creatures enter the battlefield. So that way we're able to get around board wipes and make sure our creatures are at least getting in for some damage. So we have Fires of Yavimaya that says creatures you control have haste. Sacrifice Fires of Yavimaya. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Then we have Rhythm of the Wild out of the new Ravnica Allegiance set that says creature spells you control can't be countered, and non-token creatures you control have Riot. With Riot, creatures enter the battlefield with your choice of a +1/+1 counter or haste. So this enchantment's really powerful because not only can your creatures not be countered, we also have the flexibility of adding a +1/+1 counter to your creatures or giving them haste. We have Urabraska the Hidden that says creatures you control have haste. Creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. When making this deck, I decided to include quite a few Hydras in the deck. They work out really well with Nikya because they have an X in their casting cost that usually makes them bigger when you cast them. And also some of them have different abilities when you pay a certain cost. So first up, we have Apocalypse Hydra. X, a red and a green. Apocalypse Hydra enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. If X is 5 or more, it enters the battlefield with an additional X +1/+1 counters on it. 1 in a red, remove a +1/+1 counter from Apocalypse Hydra. Apocalypse Hydra deals 1 damage to any target. So you're able to cast this for 5. This comes in as a 10/10, and then it has 10 +1/+1 counters on it. So this is a good way to get rid of some problematic creatures on the battlefield or to deal some last damage to your opponents. Then we have Lifeblood Hydra. X, green, 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 trample. Lifeblood Hydra enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. When Lifeblood Hydra dies, you gain life and draw cards equal to its power. This is a great way for us to draw some extra cards and gain some extra life. Then we have Genesis Hydra. X, green, green. When you cast Genesis Hydra, reveal the top X cards of your library. You may put a non-land permanent card with converted mana cost X or less from among them onto the battlefield. Then shuffle the rest of your library. Genesis Hydra enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. So this is a way that you're able to get 2 permanents off of 1 with Genesis Hydra. Then we have Hooded Hydra. X, green, green. Hooded Hydra enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. When Hooded Hydra dies, put a 1/1 green snake creature token onto the battlefield for each 1/1 counter on it. Morph 3 green, green. As Hooded Hydra is turned face up, put 5 +1/+1 counters on it. So when your Hooded Hydra dies, you're able to go wide with all your snake tokens, which you're able to pump later on with some of the other creatures in this deck. Then we have Mana Gorger Hydra. 2 and a green, trample. Whenever a player casts a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Mana Gorger Hydra. I've seen this creature get extremely big in some of the Commander games I've played. Since you have 4 people playing spells, this creature gets out of hand very quickly. And then we have Hydra Broodmaster, 4 green, green, and it has XX green, Monstrosity X. If this creature isn't monstrous, put X +1/+1 counters on it, and it becomes monstrous. When Hydra Broodmaster becomes monstrous, put XX green Hydra creature tokens onto the battlefield. Again, this is another way to get a bunch of Hydras onto the battlefield that you're able to pump later on. So you may be wondering how we're going to win with this deck other than just with creature damage. And that is the main way that we're going to win, is through attacking with our creatures. But there are a few creatures in this deck that are going to help close out the game quicker. So we have Hellkite Charger, 4 red and a red, Flying Haste Dragon. Whenever Hellkite Charger attacks, you may pay 5 red. If you do, untap all attacking creatures, and after this phase, there's an additional combat phase. So this is going to give you a way to do a relentless assault with your creatures and make it to where you can get 2 attacks in. So you might be able to kill 1 player and then untap and then kill a second player with this card. Then we have Pathbreaker Ibex. 4 green, green for a goat. Whenever Pathbreaker Ibex attacks, creatures you control gain trample and get +X until end of turn, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. This is a really great way to pump all your creatures up with an overrun effect, especially if you have a lot of creatures on the battlefield, and it's going to give all your creatures trample, which makes them harder to block. Then we have Endray's Forerunners, 5 green, green, green for a creature boar that has vigilance, trample, and haste. When Endray's Forerunners enters the battlefield, other creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain vigilance and trample until end of turn. This is a great budget creature that provides an effect similar to Craterhoof Behemoth for 42 cents. I've been pretty impressed with this card, especially in heavy creature decks when you're playing at a budget. This is definitely a card I would look to pick up if you have budget considerations in mind. Then we have Warstorm Surge, 5 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. Now this is a non-creature spell, which doesn't really work well with Nikya, but this effect is really powerful, so I thought it was worth including. Since we have a lot of creatures that have power 4 or greater, every time that they hit the battlefield, you're going to deal that damage to any target that you want. So this is great for clearing out blockers, and it's also great for dealing those final points of damage to your opponents as well. Then we have Flame Blast Dragon, 4 red for a creature dragon with flying. Whenever Flame Blast Dragon attacks, you may pay X in a red. If you do, Flame Blast Dragon deals X damage to any target. This is great because you're able to get rid of some problematic creatures that your opponents may have, deal that final damage to your opponent. And with Nikya on the battlefield, it's going to double all your mana. So you're going to have a lot of extra mana that you're able to pump into this mana sink and deal some extra damage to any target that you wish. Our next week's video is going to be Muldrotha the Gravetide at a $100 budget. We have some exciting news that we'll be giving away next week's deck for free to one of our lucky listeners. We will go over ways in which you're able to win this deck in next week's episode, as well as in the show notes below. Subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss those details. Thank you so much for watching this week's episode of Budget Commander. Take a second to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already. And if you have any comments or feedback, please leave them down below. See you next week.